Glenn Hegar, Texas Comptroller, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. So the numbers that you released, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised because COVID-19 and the shutdowns have had an impact. But nonetheless, it's still a very stark budget projection yesterday to go from a nearly $3 billion surplus to a nearly $4.6 billion shortfall. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So obviously, Texas, we've been impacted by COVID-19 as much as like the rest of the nation and the rest of the world, but Texas also faces a double headwind with the downturn in oil and gas prices and downturn in production numbers. So earlier in March, I started warning legislators and public that obviously Texas was going to enter into a recession like much of the world. Just the question was, we didn't know how deep and how wide. Now, at this point, we have several months of revenue collection numbers that helps give us a better gauge of what this 2-year budget cycle looks like, when the first year ends at the end of August of this year. But I also wanted to highlight numerous times that, every revenue estimate has clouds of uncertainty, but this one has greater uncertainty than any before just because there are so many unknowns with COVID-19. And again, it's not just Texas, but it's the rest of the world trying to deal with the virus. And part of the thing is we're just also making a lot of assumptions as to individual behavior, business behavior. So even if we don't have further government shutdowns, people are very hesitant and, because of personal safety concerns. So therefore, how does that impact the state economy? But overall, as you mentioned, going from a $3 billion surplus in a 2-year budget to a negative number of $4.6 billion is a significant change. A significant number. But with that being said, Texas, we're very fortunate. We have, as I say, a lot of tools in our toolbox to deal with this when the legislature gets back into session in January of 21.
And while that's really almost a reversal of $7.5 billion, is it not?
That's right. In fact, our estimations of downturn in overall general revenue tax collections is roughly about 9.5%, which is actually about 11.5 billion. But we also have some savings in the public education area, as well as online sales have been greater than we had anticipated, as so many people are working from home, purchases online. And so therefore, as the numbers shake out, it ends up being a little over $7.5 billion swing, which is a significant number. But again, as we compare ourselves to other states, not trying to say a consolation prize, but at least put it in perspective, we're in a much better shape financially than many other states in the nation and many countries around the world, in fact.
And let me just ask you on that point of online sales, the fact that, it seems like so many of us, you've got package deliveries every day. How much of an impact has that actually helped Texas because you still are able to collect that sales tax money? How much of a help has that really been?
Well, the biggest help is that last legislative session, I worked with the legislature to get a couple of pieces of legislation passed to clarify that those that are making sales online, either remotely or marketplace providers, have to collect those sales tax and remit them to the state of Texas, where other states were not able to get such legislation passed. So the point being, as we transition so much more of our purchases from in-store bricks and mortar to online, that has helped Texas in a much greater situation than some of the other states around the nation that did not move in that direction and clarify as quickly as probably they should have.
In your announcement yesterday, in your letter, I guess, to the governor, you had said that the forecast, the shortfall and all that, did not include 5% cut in agency spending. My question is, did these state agencies actually make these 5% cuts or not?
Yeah, very, very good question. And so, in fact, the way that works is the governor, legislative leadership instructed state agencies to propose how they will reduce their expenditures. Those proposals have been turned in. Then leadership goes through that process. And so, for example, our district court judges, our judges here in the state, in that area, most of it is all salaries. And so just recently I've been informed that they're not having to take that pay cut at this time. And so therefore, my point being is we assume that probably the savings is going to be about $1 billion, a little more, but those savings are not recognized until the legislature gets back into session and they pass legislation to essentially recoup those dollars. So my agency, for example, very early on in March, I decided to make sure and send script to other agencies. They need to start reducing their expenditures. We froze new hires, froze pay increases, also reviewed IT projects to what projects we needed to scale back or to shelve for the time being, just like anybody would in a downturn. And so therefore, those are real savings that have happened, but they haven't been necessarily picked up and shown on paper until the legislature gets back into session.
Okay, and so you're saying that 5% cut amounts to about $1 billion.
Probably will equal somewhere around $1 billion or a little bit more. Right now, we project it's a little bit more than that. So that 4.6 billion number will actually reduce down to about 3.6 or even 3.4, just on that factor alone. And then another factor that we have not taken into consideration is obviously Congress. The president is talking about potentially additional dollars, either to states, local governments, and or individuals. So we have not taken into account any proposed legislation, because until actually Congress passes it and the president signs it, we're not going to take that into account at this time. But I just want to point, there probably will be something passed. We just don't know what it is. So I don't want to take it into account until it's actually passed and signed.
And what was the number that the state received before in the first go around with the CARES Act?
So much like the city of Dallas, Dallas County, for example, directly got dollars from the federal government. The largest 18 cities and counties could go and get their money directly from the U.S. Treasury. The state of Texas received $6 billion. Now that $6 billion is directly for COVID-type expenses, not necessarily lost revenue. And so therefore, we are still working through how those dollars will be spent. But in total, the state of Texas, as of today, for various different programs, for example, $1.2 billion has been received for public education type COVID expenses. And overall, the state has received about $13 billion. But again, as of today, they have to be spent on very specific type categories. So a lot of those dollars are not necessarily taken into account because they may have to deal with really COVID type expenses.
But that does free up general revenues, does it not?
It does potentially free up general revenue. And part of that is going to be the question is exactly how they're going to be spent. You know, say, for example, one of the easiest ways to look at it is if you have emergency personnel out on the streets during times, well, obviously those could be swapped for state revenues. But again, as we get a little bit further into the pandemic and how those dollars will be spent. So that's in part when you talk about the budget cuts that leadership has instructed agencies to do. When that is recognized later, some of the federal dollars, obviously that's going to help that $4.6 billion be potentially reduced. But with that being said, I also have to continue to caution and highlight that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty because we haven't had a global pandemic for over 100 years. And obviously times have changed very greatly since 1917 and 1918. And so therefore, I just continue to caution legislators as well as the public that numbers are likely to change as we go through and see how the response is later this fall.
And just to double check with what you said, while the governor and the lieutenant governor, et cetera, speaker directed the agencies to make the cuts, you actually put it in place. And so those cuts were made.
So for example, in my agency, we have made those cuts. We have turned in our proposed cuts to leadership. Yet those are actually recognized on paper come next legislative session. So right now we're talking about them, but they don't show up in the bottom line numbers.
Okay. And again, the legislature has to make that happen with the bill.
When they get back into legislative session come January of next year and start working through the process of the budget, then that's when those savings will actually be recognized from a budgeting standpoint, even though from a treasury standpoint, they haven't been spent out of the state treasury.
And then your estimate, the $4.6 billion shortfall, does not include Medicaid expenses, the overage that's not accounted for during the initial budget.
That's right. Typically, during any budgeting cycle, the legislature will come back in because it's really hard to estimate exactly what Medicaid coverage will be, as well as public school education. They try to make a best guess estimation. But as of right now, we know Medicaid expenses are going up. However, the federal government earlier this year enabled states to get a better matching rate So in other words, more money will come from the federal side than the state side of 6.2%. And so therefore in this revenue estimate, it does take those into consideration, what has been provided so far, but it doesn't take any other assumptions into account, whether the feds will continue to increase that matching rate come next year, nor does it take into account exactly what the Medicaid rolls will be, because we still have another year on the state budget.
And as far as the rainy day fund, Texas is blessed with multi-billions of dollars in there, but that too is going to take a hit thanks to, as you said, the volatility in the oil and gas markets. And so I'm wondering, what are you saying, what are you projecting for the end of fiscal 2021, August 2021, where it will be compared to where you thought it might be?
Yeah, so currently we estimate as of today, at the end of this 2-year budget cycle, which as you mentioned is August of 2021 is when our budget cycle ends that we're under right now today, we will have a little over $8.7 billion in that rainy day fund or the economic stabilization fund. Now we had originally, most of the dollars that go into that state savings account are a result of severance taxes from oil and gas, severance tax collections. Now, originally we had estimated that that would be roughly about 1.6 billion from this fiscal year, yet that has been moved downward to 1.1 billion. So that's $500 million that is not going into the state savings account, and likewise an equal amount that's not going into the state highway fund, or in other words, transportation. And then come next year, it was originally estimated about 1.4 billion, but instead to each of those two funds, but now it's about 650 million. So therefore the point being is the economic stabilization fund, with lower oil prices, as well as so far the tax receipts, we've seen roughly about a 30% decrease in production volumes, and the two combined are very equal components in determining how much goes into that fund. And roughly each one of those will get about $1.5 billion less than what we had originally estimated when the Texas economy was doing much better, obviously back in February.
That's a big hit.
It's a significant amount of money. So $1.5 billion that's not going to be in the state savings account under current projections, as well as $1.5 billion that will not be going to fund transportation as we had anticipated as of last year when the economy was doing much better.
And then the next question really becomes the impact on schools, because as you know, during the last legislative session, the legislature committed to spending more state dollars for public schools and rely less on the property tax. And so now if you have lower general revenues, lower sales taxes, and less in the savings account, if you will, is the state going to be able to fully fund Texas schools for the rest of this budget, the biennium 2021, and looking down the road to 2022, 2023, do you think they will be able to remain committed to that?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion yesterday with legislative leadership as I presented some of these numbers to them. And in fact, if you look at the current budget, the $4.6 billion negative number right now compared to $3 billion positive, we have enough tools in the toolbox, whether it is the cuts that have been instructed to state agencies, whether it's the economic stabilization fund or rainy day fund, or also potentially other federal dollars, again, those that are not accounted for in this estimate. The legislature has enough tools under the current estimates to be able to make and keep all the commitments that they made last legislative session in this budget. Now, the question that you get as we get to the next budget cycle, it's really just way too far out to be able to forecast for the next budget cycle, because again, that budget cycle doesn't start until September of 2021 and goes for 2 years later. And so therefore the point is, I think it's really prudent upon us to be able to go through the fall to be able to see, are our assumptions in this estimate correct, or are they off, before we begin trying to make that baseline for the next budget projection. But, in fact, I just kind of make the point again, obviously this is very tough and difficult for a lot of individuals, a lot of businesses, governments have to deal with it as well. But the fact is, Texas has been through downturns in the past. When I was a legislator, we had one in 2003. We had one in 2011, tough budget cycles. They were not very fun. They were pretty miserable, in fact, but the fact is we got through them. And I think, we're going to get through this as well. But I do know that legislative leadership and most of the members that I talk to, that are very committed to maintaining the public education commitments that they made last legislative session.
Should the governor and top legislative leaders go back to the state agencies and say, because of these new revenue estimates, perhaps you need to go back and make additional cuts?
Yeah, originally I proposed to them to do a 5% and then look at we gave our numbers to come back to a potentially even higher number. But with that being said, what legislative leadership decided in the 5%, that applied for the entire 24 months of the current budget that we're living under, even though there were roughly about 15 months left. So in other words, nine of those months have already been spent. And so in fact, if you're looking at it from a 15-month perspective, it's really about an 8.5% cut. And I think that's probably a very appropriate amount that agencies can live within. Obviously, at some point, we're all people. And so therefore, at least in my agency with 3,000 people, can we handle more? Sure, we can do more. But at some point in time, then you start getting into the question, are you going to have to furlough and or lay off employees? And I think most businesses want those individuals, they're functioning to be able to process their tax returns, their paperwork, and make sure that when they're able to get back to work, they get back to doing business here in the state of Texas as quickly as possible. So I think my point being is there's an appropriate balance there that needs to be made to ensure that we're servicing the businesses and the individuals, the Texans, that they can get back to doing their jobs, which is what everybody wants to.
And the state hasn't had to furlough anybody, right?
No, we have not. No, the state has not.
Okay, just a couple more questions, and I really do appreciate your time. You talked a little bit about the Texas economy, and I'm just wondering, you said Texas has still been able to weather this better than other states, but looking in your crystal ball, given the fact of just, the impact that the pandemic has had on the economy, and then you have the oil and gas, where do you see Texas as relates to other states? Are we going to fall further behind than the national average because of oil and gas?
Yeah, if you look at the last several years, Texas has outpaced the national average in economic output and job growth. But obviously, because of the double headwinds that we talked about earlier and in asking your question, not only the pandemic, but the impacts that it's having on the oil and gas industry, at least for this year, we don't think that the impact of Texas on an average compared to other states is as deep as other states. For example, those that are much more based on tourism industry and or based on manufacturing industry that have been impacted more than Texas, because overall, Texas does have a very diverse economy, much more so than we have been in many decades prior. Yet in the second year, as in next year, we do think Texas is probably going to lag behind the national average because of that double headwind. So in other words, if you look at a 2-year average, the U.S. impact overall and the Texas impact will be about the same, but it will be a little bit longer for Texas because of that double headwind. But undoubtedly, we feel as though as we get towards the end of next year, Texas will start outpacing the national average economically, at least under the current forecast that we're providing. But again, all of that is subject to change depending on business and individual behavior and how we continue to deal with the pandemic, not just here in Texas, the United States, but literally around the world.
And my last question to you is, you talked about the confidence that people have to have, Texans have to be willing to go out, spend money, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, what is your message to Texans who, have watched this interview, as far as what can they do to make sure that the economy continues to keep humming along, because that does have a direct impact on how much money schools will have, how much money the state will have to spend on transportation and other important items, going forward.
I think it's really important that we continue to keep in mind other people and their concerns. And as we were talking before we got on the interview, I have a 15-year-old daughter and twin boy and girl that are 12 years old. And so we've had a lot of discussions with them. And the new norm is we're going to wear masks. And, the fact is the Hagers, they wear that as much out of respect for other people and their concerns than it is for us. And so, I don't like it. It's not something that I would choose to do every day, but it's the new norm that we live in. And the fact is, I think we all need to be responsible as possible, in other words, to make sure that we balance the health and safety, protect those that are more vulnerable, but then also with that, try to keep and learn to live, unfortunately, with the virus that's not going away anytime soon. So, we've learned that during the summertime, it's not going to disappear. It's here to stay, and so therefore we have to learn to live with it. We can't live, essentially in a bubble, at least in the Hegar household. But we also have to be very responsible, and I think there's a balance there to where we can keep, the health and safety, but also the economy going as much as possible. Because unfortunately, it's really sad that a lot of Americans and a lot of Texans have lost their jobs. And it's very real to those individuals. And so, a commitment on all of our part to at least try to make sure that we keep the economy going and improving is really critical for those people who are really struggling right now with either unemployment and or loss of their jobs.
Comptroller Glenn Hegar, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
You too.
Thank you.